Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favour, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works, begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. I recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you to this Assembly, I have some guests to introduce in your gallery, Mr. Speaker, who are here this morning for the kickoff event for Green Shirt Day to raise awareness for organ donation, Mr. Speaker, which has been proclaimed to be held on Sunday, April the 7th. Mr. Speaker, in your gallery, we have Charlotte Lois Brown, who's a Regina resident and needed a double lung transplant due to a terminal illness. She received this transplant in Edmonton 2017 and was back in Regina 3 months later and is a strong advocate for organ donation now. We also have Chris Willenberg, who's an associate professor at the University of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, when he found out his then girlfriend, now wife Erin, was on dialysis and needed a kidney transplant, he tested to see if he would be a match. He was a perfect match, Mr. Speaker. And I just heard this morning that because of that, Cosmopolitan magazine named him, I think it was, most romantic man in North America. Mr. Speaker, he set the bar far too high for the rest of us. And they are accompanied today, Mr. Speaker, by Scott Livingston, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Saskatchewan Health Authority. Mr. Speaker, I would ask all members to please give them a warm welcome to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to join in with the Minister opposite in welcoming these guests to their Legislative Assembly today in honor of Green Shirt Day and organ donation in the province. I had the pleasure, along with a number of our colleagues from this House, to stand on the steps today and don our green shirts. We were told we weren't all allowed to wear them in the Assembly today, which makes sense because it's a t-shirt, we are showing our support on this side of the House as well. A really important cause and an opportunity to raise awareness about the importance of organ donation in our province. I want to welcome Charlotte, Chris, and of course Scott to their Assembly today and ask all members to join me in doing so.
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to request leave for an extended introduction.
Minister's requested leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you and all members of the Legislative Assembly, I would like to welcome, and sitting in your gallery, Keith Comstock, his wife Janet, and son Matthew. Keith is an outstanding individual who has chosen to retire after 40 years of service to the Crown. His current post is Assistant Deputy Minister of Municipal Relations at the Ministry of Government Relations. Back in 1979, when the Nax, my Sharona, was rocking the radio airwaves, Keith, a farm boy from Mossbank, decided to join the provincial civil service. He started in Prince Albert as one of the first staff members at the new provincial correctional facility. His career path led to taking on more roles with greater responsibility and working with municipal governments. Finally, he landed in the current role as Assistant Deputy Minister, where he has served for over 8 years. He has been responsible for training a few new ministers in GR, including the current Minister of Health, the current Minister of Finance, and a member from Cut Knife Turtleford. Keith is a shining testament of what professional civil servants do each day and has been a positive example each and every day to the people that he served in Saskatchewan. Keith, we wish you well, and I ask all members to welcome him and his family to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I too want to join the Minister in welcoming and thanking Keith for his outstanding career in public service and all the premiers you have served through the time done an outstanding job. I think about the Cities Act that you helped steer through was a major accomplishment. But I think we go back when I think you worked in culture, youth and rec, and the kind of work that you did then. And so I just want to say what a great person Keith is and how he really represents public service so well, dedicated to the people of Saskatchewan. So thank you, Keith, and welcome to your legislature and your families too. Thank you.
I recognize the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to join my colleagues in welcoming Keith and his family to the Legislative Assembly. I had the honour of being able to work with Keith when I was Minister responsible for Government Relations, but it was also a delight to meet his wife, Janet. There was a few occasions where we got to be at a function together and Janet would be there, and we had a great time and great conversations together. And the other thing that members may not know, but this couple are amazing dancers. They are beautiful to watch on the dance floor. I admire them, and I wish them well in retirement and keep on dancing.
Recognize the member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the ministers and the member from Saskatoon Centre in welcoming the Comstock family to their Legislative Assembly. Know them well through St. Mark's Church, where we happen to attend together, and thank them for their service to the province and the community in which they belong. So, I'd like to ask all members to join with me in welcoming them to their legislature.
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you to the Assembly, I'd like to join with the Minister and a number of other members who spoke about Keith. I'd like to welcome Keith and his family today, Mr. Speaker. I've known Keith for many years. I was in municipal work before politics, Mr. Speaker. What I didn't realize was that Keith was in government work for 40 years. I didn't realize he'd started his career before I was born. Mr. Speaker, while I knew Keith in my previous profession, where I really got to know him well was during my time as Minister of Government Relations. Mr. Speaker, he was just a huge help to me on several difficult files that we worked on together. Mr. Speaker, 40 years is a long time. It shows a great deal of dedication. I want to thank him for his dedication to the province and wish him and his family all the best in enjoying Keith's retirement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
It's my pleasure this afternoon to rise and introduce a group of grade 9 to 11 students from Sheldon Williams Collegiate here in Regina. Mr. Speaker, these young students, along with their teacher, Christine Mishra, are members of the Sheldon Williams Collegiate robotics team, and I will be delivering a member's statement shortly. But for now, I'd like all members to join me in welcoming these guests to their Legislative Assembly.
I recognize the Minister of Education.
Speaker, thank you very much. I too would like to join the member in welcoming the several members from Sheldon Williams Collegiate Robotics team to their legislature. I'm told they tried to get some of their robotics through the security, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure they were very successful with that. But it's terrific to see so many Saskatchewan students like these who are more and more interested in robotics, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that that's preparing them for very, very interesting careers, not just in science and mathematics, but engineering and technology, Mr. Speaker. So I too would like to join the member in welcoming these fine students to their legislature.
Here, here, here.
Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join the Minister and my colleagues for recognizing and congratulating Keith Comstock on his retirement. I had the privilege of working with Keith in my former life as SARM Board and SARM President. We did a lot of good work together, and I think it'd be remiss if I didn't say Keith was a strong advocate for all of Saskatchewan and did a lot of good work in all the legislation and things like that were brought forward. So I just want to recognize Keith and his wife Janet and family. And Janet, I wish you all the well with tolerating him for every day now, but it's all good. But Keith and I have become good friends over the years, and I just wanted to recognize him, and I wish him well, and I want all members to recognize Keith for the work he did for the province of Saskatchewan and welcome him here. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon, Newtana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, I'd like to introduce to the Assembly a good friend of mine in the East Gallery, Mr. Cody Genie. Cody was a former SLIP student here in the Assembly before he became my constituency assistant. But I've known Cody for many years as a hard worker and volunteer for the Ness Creek Music Festival. He is here in Regina doing his CPLED, his training to become a lawyer, so he left my office to go to law school, if you can believe it, Mr. Speaker. But he's just about done. He'll be a baby lawyer in July, and at the same time he's welcoming his first baby. Sofarina, I think is her name, Jeannie? I probably got that wrong. And anyways, Cody's a farming family south of Moose Jaw, and very interested in politics and is interested in municipal politics. You never know, and we might see him here on the floor someday too. So please, if everyone would welcome Cody Genie to his Legislative Assembly.
Recognize a member for Moose Jaw, Waccamaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, I have 12 members from our community. They're the Young at Heart. They're church ministry, ministering to seniors from the Church of God, and they're accompanied by their activity coordinator and pastor, Walter Engel. So I would like everybody to welcome them to their legislature.
Recognize a member for Moose Jaw North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if I could, I'd like to go along with the member from Waccamaw and welcome these fine people from the friendly city. It's good to see them here and thank them for the service they do to seniors. And with every passing day, it gets a little bit more important. So I appreciate the work they do. So, and welcome to their assembly.
Recognize a member from Cannington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you to the Assembly, I would like to introduce, seated in the West Gallery, 22 grade 8 students from the Oxbow Prairie Horizon School. Along with them is their teacher, Carrie Crossman, and parent chaperones, and I think the kids are probably chaperoning the parents, Tamara Brock, Doug Pierce, Michelle Sinclair, Annie Garling, and Amy Dyer. I would like to ask the Assembly to welcome all of them to their assembly.
Presenting petitions. Recognize the member for Saskatoon, Newtana.
I know it's here somewhere, Mr. Speaker. I had it a minute ago.
I bet it's on the GTH.
I could probably make it up because I've said it so many times before. There it is. All right. Thanks for your forbearance, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present a petition on the Regina Bypass Project. The people who signed this petition would like to bring to our attention the following. Very few details about the Regina Bypass Project, especially the financial details, are publicly available, despite it being the costliest infrastructure project funded by taxpayers in the province's history. Ministry officials have identified and documented major deficiencies in the project, Mr. Speaker, but the government has refused to release those for public review. In the Assembly, the previous Minister of Highways referenced the breach of an aquifer in Wascana Creek as an example of one of these major deficiencies. However, our current Minister of Highways has repeatedly stated on the record that there are no major deficiencies on this bypass. Saskatchewan people will be paying for this piece of infrastructure for the next 30 years, and in the interest of government transparency, these contradictory statements do require immediate clarification. So I'll read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to immediately release a full, unredacted copy of records detailing all minor and major deficiencies identified in the Regina Bypass project to date. Mr. Speaker, the individuals who have signed this petition today are from the city of Moose Jaw. I so submit.
Recognize the member for Moose Jaw, Waccamaw.
He's ready.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to rise today to present a petition from the citizens who are opposed to the Justin Trudeau, Ralph Goodale Liberal Party of Canada job-killing, soul-sucking, unconstitutional, non-emitting, supported by the Saskatchewan NDP carbon tax. On April 1st, the Trudeau government slapped a carbon tax plus GST on fuel, power, and home heating, which will also drive up the cost of
just about everything else. Unfortunately, it's no April Fool's joke. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action to cause the government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by the citizens of Hepburn, Rosetown, Saskatoon, Warman, Martinsville, and Kindersley. I do so present.
You're here.
Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I am proud to stand in my place today to present a petition for the challenges of those living with the need for dialysis treatment. There are a growing number of individuals living with kidney failure, and there's a disproportionate burden amongst those living in northwestern Saskatchewan communities. Mr. Speaker, there's a regional hospital in Isle La Crosse, which is linked to Telehealth Saskatchewan, as well as La Loche. Through the use of telehealth video conferencing technology, clients will be able to see and access a nephrologist without having to make a trip to Saskatoon for all their consultations. Mr. Speaker, the access to health services is one of the 12 key determinants of health outcomes. A satellite dialysis unit in the area would help create optimal health outcomes while minimizing healthcare costs and the financial burden to patients. So the prayer reads as follows, Mr. Speaker. To cause the provincial government to provide the public funding to set up a satellite unit in northwestern Saskatchewan to provide hemodialysis treatment that is in closer proximity to patients' homes. This would greatly lessen the burden for out-of-pocket costs for the people from this area who are undergoing kidney dialysis. This would allow northwestern people with kidney failure to live where they want to live and not have to be forced to move in order to stay alive. The people that have signed these many pages of petition that we've presented over the last several years come from all throughout Saskatchewan. And on this particular page, Mr. Speaker, the people that have signed this petition are primarily from La Loche and Isle La Crosse, and I so present.
Here. There's a member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise again today to present a petition calling for critical supports for survivors of domestic violence. The individuals who signed this petition wish to bring to our attention the following. Saskatchewan has the highest rates of domestic violence amongst all of the provinces in Canada, and employees who are survivors of domestic violence should be able to take a leave of absence from their employment without penalty. Mr. Speaker, this is what we've called for in our private members' bill, which seeks to provide 5 days paid leave for survivors of domestic violence. Yet again, I'm explaining to the Sask Party that this isn't asking them to do anything new in this country. In fact, it exists in some form in Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, Newfoundland and Labrador, PEI, and New Brunswick. Mr. Speaker, there's only a few more weeks, well, too many, but 5-ish weeks of session left, but that provides the Sask Party ample opportunity to pass that private members' bill. It's about time they do that. The least they can do is give as many options as possible to survivors of domestic violence that exist in other provinces. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Legislative Assembly to pass legislation providing critical support for survivors of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, the individuals signing the petition today come from Saskatoon. I do so present.
Then as a member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present a petition calling for a $15 an hour minimum wage. Mr. Speaker, the petitioners are well aware that as of yesterday, or April 1st, pardon me, Mr. Speaker, that Saskatchewan once again became the lowest minimum wage jurisdiction in all of Canada, Mr. Speaker. They're well aware that that's a shame. Mr. Speaker, they're well aware that it's an example of Sask Party government laggard behavior as opposed to leadership, which workers are looking to this government to demonstrate. They're well aware that a $15 an hour minimum wage will improve health and well-being and lift Saskatchewan workers out of poverty. They're aware that a $15 minimum wage will benefit local businesses and support local economies by putting money in workers' pockets to spend in their community. Mr. Speaker, in the prayer that reads as follows, the petitioners respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to adopt a plan to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour for all workers. Mr. Speaker, this particular petition is one of a great number that were signed in a drive by the Saskatchewan Federation of Labour. It is signed by citizens from the good city of Saskatoon. I so present.
Hear, hear.
As a member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present a petition calling for this government to quit associating with climate change deniers and to take real action to fight climate change. Mr. Speaker, the petitioners wish to bring to our attention that Saskatchewan produces the highest greenhouse gas emissions per capita in all of Canada, that this government has failed to tackle climate change or reduce emissions according to the province's own targets. They want to bring to our attention that slashing programs and funding for the environment have set this province on a backward course. And they wish to bring to our attention the fact that there has been a steady increase in payments under the Provincial Disaster Assistance Program. Mr. Speaker, the petitioners, who are part of the hundreds of students that gathered on the steps of this building, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan enact a real plan and allocate appropriate funding in the provincial budget to tackle climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, helping families transition to energy-efficient homes, and encouraging everyone in the province to take real action to protect the environment. I so present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, today I am wearing green to honor Logan Boulet's legacy. Green Shirt Day will be held April 7th, 2019 for organ donor awareness and registration. On April 7th, 2018, Humboldt Broncos defenseman Logan Boulet succumbed to his injuries. His parents, Bernadine and Toby Boulet, offered to donate his organs so that 6 lives could be saved. They did so because Logan told his parents he was registering as an organ donor. Logan was inspired by his coach, who passed away in 2017, and was also an organ donor who saved 6 lives. The courageous and generous act made by the Boulet family triggered over 100,000 people to register to become organ donors, creating the Logan Boulet effect. Green Shirt Day hopes to honor, remember, and recognize all the victims of the fatal crash, and to continue Logan's legacy by inspiring Canadians to talk to their families and register as organ donors. Mr. Speaker, over 1,600 Canadians are added to organ waitlists every year, hoping to receive a life-saving organ transplant. One donor can benefit more than 75 people and save up to 8 lives. I know this to be true personally, as my friend's 18-month-old, Nash Beliski Crawford, would not be alive today if not for the heart transplant he recently received. I ask all members to wear green to keep the Logan Boulet effect alive and inspire more Canadians to become organ donors. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Rostern Shellbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this Saturday marks the 1-year anniversary of the Humboldt Broncos bus crash. A devastating tragedy that resonated with so many people in this province and so many people around the world. And out of that tragedy, a story of selflessness and hope emerged when it became public that Logan Boulet was an organ donor. Overcoming the extreme stress and the overwhelming grief of the situation, his parents courageously supported his decision, resulting in 6 lives being saved. The public reaction, now called the Logan Boulet effect, resulted in more than 100,000 Canadians signing up to become organ donors. And Saskatchewan hopes to increase that number further as we launch an organ donor registry in our province as part of this year's budget. Mr. Speaker, Logan's parents, Bernadine and Toby Boulet, have decided to honor the anniversary of their son's donation and the effect that it had on all Canadians by creating Green Shirt Day. And I'm proud to announce that our government has proclaimed April 7th to be Green Shirt Day. We ask that all Saskatchewan people honor Logan and honor Logan's legacy by wearing green on Sunday and again to work or school on Monday the 8th. We also encourage everyone to follow Logan's example and talk to their families about organ donation so their wishes are known. Mr. Speaker, I would ask all members of this Assembly to join me in proclaiming April 7th as Green Shirt Day.
Recognize the member for John Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to acknowledge an amazing program at Sheldon Williams Collegiate, a school here in Regina that has become a leader in technology and innovation. The Sheldon Williams robotics teams Short but illustrious history began in 2015 when teacher Christine Mishra started the Coding Club. The club soon merged with the Robotics Club and began participating in the Robot Rumble competition hosted each year by Sask Polytech in Saskatoon. Since then, the Coding Club and Robotics team have grown and expanded. They've sent 10 students to the competition for the last 2 years in a row, and I'm told that almost everyone on the team wants to compete again next year. And if that wasn't amazing enough, Mr. Speaker, this year, Christine received a $2,400 STEM grant from Best Buy Canada. This money will be used to introduce new students to coding, expand the existing club, and upgrade the equipment for the robotics team and computer science classes. Out of over 275 applications, the Sheldon Williams application was one of only 13 schools across Canada to receive the grant. Christine is here today in the East Gallery with her robotics team, including Varshitha Banjera. You maybe just give us a wave. Zara Al-Kashwan, Mohammed Qureshi, Ziggy or Tom Huang, David Quinton Gaylord, Aidan Most, Benjamin Jackson Reynolds, Rishav or Ray Chakraborty, Vish Patel, and Divi Patel. I would like all members to join me in congratulating Christine and the Sheldon Williams robotics team for invite all members to join me in welcoming these young leaders to their Legislative Assembly. Thank you.
As a member for Saskatoon Churchill Wildwood.
I rise in the House today to highlight an inspiring community builder, Kent Smith-Windsor. Kent is a pillar of the community and a well-known business advocate in Saskatoon. He gave over 21 years of dedicated service to his city as the former executive director of the Greater Saskatoon Chamber of Commerce. A graduate of the University of Saskatchewan, Kent was appointed executive director of the Chamber, Saskatchewan's largest business organization, in 1996. He retired in May of 2017. With his leadership, the Chamber was able to build one of the best business climates in Canada, making Saskatoon a city of opportunity for local entrepreneurs. Upon his retirement, Kent was asked what he thought was his greatest accomplishment. He responded, and I quote, "Helping more people understand that a successful business community is the underpinning of a successful community," end quote. On March 20th of this year, Kent was recognized for his dedication and many accomplishments when he received the Shirley Ryan Lifetime Achievement Award at this year's NSBA Business Builders Awards. This award is given to an individual for their outstanding long-term contributions to their business or occupation, whose leadership skills and passion have benefited the Saskatoon business community overall. Kent, congratulations on the well-deserved recognition. You have certainly left a positive footprint on the business and economic climate of both Saskatoon and the province of Saskatchewan. Thank you.
As a member for Melville Saltcoats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today it is my privilege to rise again and acknowledge one of our dedicated provincial public servants. Mr. Speaker, after 4 decades with the Government of Saskatchewan, Keith Comstock will be leaving us to enjoy a well-earned retirement. Keith is well known for his calm and professional characteristics, as well as his humility and humour. Keith, from time to time, will reference his mom's management philosophy, which I understand was, "I may not be able to make you do what I want you to do, but I can make you wish you had." Mr. Speaker, I've only had the honour of knowing Keith for just over a year, but in this short time I've come to rely on his counsel, his experience, and his good nature. And I've learned just how much he is respected by his peers at Summa, Sarm, New North, and the countless mayors, reeves, councillors, and municipal officials he's met throughout his distinguished career. He's also provided tremendous leadership on a number of major projects during his tenure, including the design, implementation, and evolution of the Municipal Revenue Sharing Program, which has provided $2.8 billion to Saskatchewan municipalities since 2007 and 8. And his work on federal provincial infrastructure programs so our municipalities have the investments they need. Those are just a couple of the highlights. For the government, Keith's departure will be a great loss. Now, the office may be a little quieter with Keith's departure, but we will continue to hear about his many positive contributions to this great province for years to come. I now ask my colleagues in this Assembly to please join me in wishing Keith a happy retirement and thank him for his service to Saskatchewan.
As a member from Moose Jaw North.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to congratulate two high school teams from my constituency of Moose Jaw North, the Peacock Toilers girls basketball team and the Central Cyclones boys basketball team. Both teams saw great success at Hoopla this past month. Mr. Speaker, for the second straight year, the Peacock Toilers came home with a bronze medal after their 70-53 victory over the Notre Dame Hounds in the 4A girls' third-place final. Though they were defeated in a heartbreaking loss against Melfort in the semifinals, the team walked away from the tournament with their heads held high, proudly wearing their bronze medals. And, Mr. Speaker, for the Central Cyclones, the third time was a charm for the Hoopla tournament. After falling short in back-to-back provincials, the Cyclones came out on top, winning the 4A Boys Championship game. The final score was 98-59. Many of the teammates have been playing together in their entire school basketball careers, so it was a special experience to share together. This championship capped a 29-5 overall record this season, leading to the provincials. Mr. Speaker, Hoopla always brings the best athletes from every corner of our province together, and it was very encouraging to have two Moose Jaw teams land among the best at the tournament. Congratulations to the players, the coaches, and the volunteers for the successful season of 2018-2019. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As a member for Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to announce that Manitoba has joined our government and will be launching a legal challenge of the federal government's decision to impose a carbon tax. Just like our government, the government of Manitoba has realized that this federally imposed carbon tax would hurt Manitobans and has no effect on reducing carbon. Premier Pallister said, quote, "This conduct by the federal government is unfair to Manitobans. It threatens jobs and economic growth throughout Manitoba. It makes it more expensive to feed our families and keep them warm during the winter. It hurts northern Manitobans. It hurts our agricultural industry and our transportation sector." End quote. Just like Saskatchewan, they introduced a Made in Manitoba climate and green plan that would be better for their economy and better for the environment, but was rejected by the federal government. Mr. Speaker, today Manitoba has joined the fight against the carbon tax. 88% of Saskatchewan people support the fight against the carbon tax. Why don't the members opposite? The Leader of the Opposition said, quote, "We applaud the federal government's recent announcement of a minimum price on carbon," end quote. Mr. Speaker, the members opposite are clearly still out of touch with Saskatchewan people.
Hear, hear. Question period. I recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, too many Saskatchewan people can't access high-quality childcare, and if they can find a spot, far too many cannot afford to pay. Childcare subsidies in this province have not kept pace with the rising cost of living, and they haven't been re-examined, Mr. Speaker, since 1982. Continuing with our theme of taking questions from the public, Alicia Johnson wants to know, why hasn't the subsidy been updated in decades, and what is the plan to improve these rates?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, we have some of the most affordable child care in the country, Mr. Speaker. The subsidy is administered, of course, through the Ministry of Social Services, Mr. Speaker, but I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that this government is fully committed to ensuring that we provide the right amount of child care, Mr. Speaker, for the people of this province. Last year, Mr. Speaker, we signed an early childhood agreement with the federal government, Mr. Speaker, which increased the number of licensed child care spaces to children in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, and as well as increasing the number of intensive child care spaces, Mr. Speaker, for children that need that support, Mr. Speaker. So the record of this government is very clear in terms of our support for licensed child care spaces, Mr. Speaker, an increase in over 40% in licensed child care spaces since this government since this party was got the privilege of forming government, Mr. Speaker. We stand by that record, Mr. Speaker. More work to do, Mr. Speaker, but we'll continue that on that course.
I recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the minister paints a nice picture, but for those on the ground, it's a much different view. We know that the amount the government is spending on childcare subsidies has been going down year over year, and it's no wonder, Mr. Speaker. At the current cutoff rate, a family with one child can't earn more than $19,680 a year. People simply aren't able to qualify for support. Mr. Speaker, early learning centres are more than just childcare. They provide meaningful support and education for kids at the most important developmental stage. Does the minister recognize that being able to access and afford childcare in this province is essential to a strong economy? And will he agree to review the subsidy rates to get us even anywhere close to where the other provinces are at?
I recognize the Minister of Education.
Speaker, well, Mr. Speaker, I indicated in my first answer, Mr. Speaker, we have some of the most affordable childcare spaces in this province, Mr. Speaker. Since 2007, $200 million increase, Mr. Speaker, over 6,000 new childcare licensed spaces since 2007 alone, Mr. Speaker. That's over a 40% increase in the number of childcare spaces that were available when we had the privilege of forming government, Mr. Speaker. Over 1,000 new childcare spaces were implemented in the fall of 2017 alone, Mr. Speaker. So we're certainly on the right track. We want to make sure that parents in this province have access to good quality childcare, Mr. Speaker. And the record of this government since forming government is pretty clear, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to do that work. We'll continue to have conversations to ensure that parents have the right choice for their children, Mr. Speaker. We know parents have choices, but we want to make sure that they have the right choices for their children so that those children can be successful as they enter their educational journey, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the cap to access the low-income tax credit is $32,000, but households making $20,000 can be left without help from this government to pay daycare fees. This is literally putting people in positions where they can't afford to work. It's bad for families, Mr. Speaker, and it's bad for our economy. The government's own early years reports calls ECE what it is, an investment. For every dollar spent on early years, $6 or more are returned to our economy. The current early years plan is set to expire in mere months. Will this government commit today to a meaningful, long overdue overhaul of our childcare system?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, since 2008-9, Mr. Speaker, we've seen a 117% increase, Mr. Speaker, in the investment in early years. This government, Mr. Speaker, understands the importance of early childhood intervention, Mr. Speaker. We have a number of intervention programs, Mr. Speaker, across this province to ensure that children have the best possible start when they start their educational journey, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to ensuring that those children have the best possible start, Mr. Speaker. That's why you've seen increased investments, Mr. Speaker. Certainly our record in terms of taking people off the tax rolls, Mr. Speaker, making life more affordable for people, Mr. Speaker, so that they can afford to provide the child care space that they need, Mr. Speaker, and the care that those children need, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue on this track. We're going to continue to do the good work that we do, Mr. Speaker. We know there's more to do. There's always more work to do, Mr. Speaker, but I think the record of this government speaks for itself.
Recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, a $19,000 cutoff for a family in 1982. I think those are two numbers that people of Saskatchewan will be very surprised to learn of. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, my friend from Saskatoon Fairview asked the Health Minister how he can expect the school system to pick up the slack in supporting kids with autism once they turn 7. And if you listen to the minister, Mr. Speaker, in his response, you'd think that everything was just fine. But anyone who's been anywhere near a classroom will tell you that simply isn't the case. Over the last 4 years, there are fewer occupational therapists and fewer speech and language pathologists working in our schools. Saskatchewan should be the best place in Canada to be a kid. How can the minister boast about his record on supports for autism when there are fewer supports in the classroom to address more and more complex needs?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've got to correct the record, Mr. Speaker. Occupational language pathologists are up 41%, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in our school system, Mr. Speaker, occupational therapists up 26%, student support teachers 20%, psychologists up 10%, Mr. Speaker, since we've had the privilege of forming government. Mr. Speaker, the funds that are provided to our school divisions, Mr. Speaker, are provided unconditionally. We've seen record investments in education, Mr. Speaker, over the last 2 years. This year, the largest operating budget for public education in the history of this province, Mr. Speaker. We know there's work to do, Mr. Speaker, but I think our commitment to public education is shown in the commitments that we've made through the last 2 budgets, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to work with school divisions to ensure that the programming that children need are provided through those school systems, Mr. Speaker, but I don't think anyone can say that we're turning our back on this issue. More investment, Mr. Speaker, more professionals in the classroom.
Recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'll stand by my statistics and I'll stand by the testimony of those who are working in our schools and those parents of kids trying to access supports in schools. Mr. Speaker, the minister has the same information that we do and he should be concerned. His own data shows that nearly half of the children in this province starting kindergarten aren't ready to learn. And this measure has been getting worse. Kids aren't getting adequate early years supports, and it's no better once they're in school. The minister claims that children with autism who are too old to qualify or who have aged out of eligibility while they waited for this government to keep its campaign promise will fare okay with existing supports in our schools. Schools where there is growing enrollment, increasing complexity, stagnant EA support, and fewer needed specialized supports like SLP and OT. Does the minister realize that his government's failure to invest in our classroom is hurting students who are in the greatest need?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, here's the number for the member, Mr. Speaker. A 2,340% increase, Mr. Speaker, in funding for autism in our school systems, Mr. Speaker. 500,000, Mr. Speaker, when we formed government, Mr. Speaker, $12.2 million annually into autism services and supports in this province, Mr. Speaker. That speaks for itself. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've heard the member opposite and her leader say it's not about money, Mr. Speaker, it's about results, and we agree. That's why in this year's budget, in addition to increasing the operating budget, Mr. Speaker, by a significant amount, we put some money aside, Mr. Speaker, to talk about how we can deliver education services to the kids in this province, Mr. Speaker, more efficiently and more effectively, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, the amount of money that's been put into the education system, the increases have been significant, but we also know that we need to work harder in terms of making sure that we have successes in the classroom, Mr. Speaker. Member opposite has referenced that, Mr. Speaker. It's about results, and we know that, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to have our conversations with our educational professionals to make sure we do just that.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert, Northcote.
Auto body shops in Saskatchewan are concerned about changes SGI is making for small shops. Forcing small businesses to close or purchase tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment that they can't afford isn't fair. The minister said in scrums yesterday that, quote, I think maybe there's an overreaction from both sides here, and because as far as I know, there's not many changes coming to SGI that's going to have a terrible impact on rural body shops. Well, Mr. Speaker, hundreds of Saskatchewan businesses in rural and urban Saskatchewan are concerned that the minister may think this is an overreaction. We spoke this morning to Barb Jennard, who runs Sunny Auto Body in Maple Creek, and she has this question for the minister. Why is the minister forcing small rural shops to take on these costs they can't afford? Why are they putting another nail in the coffin of rural Saskatchewan? Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Crown Investments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
it's about safety on our highways, safety on our roads in Saskatchewan. Vehicles, maybe the member from Athabasca would like to answer the question? Because, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer it. Mr. Speaker, it's about safety on our highways, Mr. Speaker. And what's happened now, Mr. Speaker, with the materials, Mr. Speaker, what happens now with the materials and the manufacturing of the current vehicles, there's certain tools and certain requirements that have to be done. Right. Mr. Speaker, there's still lots of vehicles that everybody out there, every body shop out there will be able to fix. Right. I, for one, don't want a high-tech vehicle fixed by old methods and old tools, Mr. Speaker. They have to have the proper tools, the proper equipment to be able to fix these vehicles properly, so that when they get back on the highway, Mr. Speaker, that they're safe, that nobody will get killed or injured because of that vehicle fixed improperly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
The minister said nothing to ease the concerns of these small business owners. Mr. Speaker, these shops are rightfully worried because this is their livelihoods, and these new costs are unaffordable. A few months ago, a spokesperson for SGI mentioned these impending changes at a conference. But yesterday, the minister said no decision has been made and that any changes are a long way off. That the response from business owners was an overreaction, and that, quote, maybe somebody from SGI got out a little ahead of themselves. The minister for SGI is the one responsible. He shouldn't be throwing officials from the Crown Corporation under the bus. Who is creating this confusion, SGI or the Sask Party government? When is SGI implementing these changes, and when will the minister take responsibility for his file?
Recognize the Minister for Crown Investments.
Speaker, I'm happy to take responsibility for my file, Mr. Speaker. The great work that we've done and the people out over at SGI have done, Mr. Speaker, on all our files at SGI. I mean, Mr. Speaker, that's uncalled for from that member opposite. Mr. Speaker, we have our auto body shops, Mr. Speaker, are paid over $92 per hour. Mr. Speaker, the average in Western Canada, that's BC, you know, in case somebody doesn't know over there, BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, is $75 an hour. Right. So, Mr. Speaker, we do pay our auto body shops a very fair rate. And, Mr. Speaker, we do allow them to fix whatever vehicles, Mr. Speaker. If they don't have the proper equipment, they won't be able to fix that certain vehicle, Mr. Speaker. That's just common sense. So, Mr. Speaker, we do stand up, and we do stand up for our small businesses and our small communities throughout the province, Mr. Speaker. I always have and I always will. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize a member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday when I asked about an inquiry into the GTH, an inquiry that the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General actually called for, the current minister told this Assembly, quote, "It's done." Well, what's done, Mr. Speaker? There are more loose ends in this mess than in a bowl of spaghetti. Right. How much land has the fancy Bay Street real estate firm sold? What's the plan for Sask Power's $25 million pasture out there? When will the GTH recoup its $40 million of debt? When will the legislation be changed to get rid of Bill Boyd's municipality? And who on earth is going to take it over? Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Hear.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the members opposite spent a lot of time attacking the GTH. They spent a lot of time attacking the nearly 1,000 people that work there. They attacked the $485 million in private investment. They attacked the 4,800 trucks that move in and out of there every week. Mr. Speaker, this is a project that has been examined and examined thoroughly by the provincial auditor, by the Conflict of Interest Commissioner, by the RCMP that spent 7,500 hours doing it. Mr. Speaker, if the members have something new or something different, let them take it to the RCMP, let them take it to the provincial auditor, and take it wherever they feel is appropriate. But, Mr. Speaker, there's nothing new there. Hear, hear.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, the GTH isn't exactly something you just sweep under the rug. It's a municipality created by this government, Mr. Speaker.
That's right.
So the questions go on. Did Bill Boyd just decide on his own to promise Loblaws and CP massive bypass infrastructure so their trucks didn't have to come to a full stop? The promise of free-flow interchanges aren't in either contract, Mr. Speaker. They cost taxpayers millions and were the reason that GTH elbowed highways out of the way in the first place and scrambled to acquire the notorious East parcels. It seems the minister's getting a little tired of answering questions about this mess. No wonder. That cabinet and that minister have blocked more witnesses from testifying in committee than Justin Trudeau. Will the minister finally do the right thing and call the inquiry today?
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I find it more than passing strange that the members' office that want to make a comparison to this side of the House with Justin Trudeau. Right. These are people that are exactly on the same page as Justin Trudeau on the unfair carbon tax that is crippling our economy. Mr. Speaker, that is the direction the people are going over there. It's totally unfair to accuse this side of the House of being like Justin Trudeau when that side of the House is exactly on the same page as Justin Trudeau. Mr. Speaker, the members opposite talk about the interchanges and the roadways in and out. The member from Regina Rosemont presented petition after petition after petition to get the trucks off of Dewdney. Mr. Speaker, that's what the interchanges were intended to do, and Mr. Speaker, that's what's happened. The accident rate in that area has dropped to nearly zero. We hear no more complaints about what's going on Dewdney Avenue, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Minister of Health held off on committing to fully cover mifepristone, which is used for medical abortions. I and many others were disappointed. Saskatchewan is the only province that doesn't cover mifepristone, and the reasoning behind it doesn't make much sense, Mr. Speaker. If we're talking about cost, let's add up the dollars. Mifepristone costs roughly $400 compared to $1,000 in the surgical procedure. If this medication was fully covered, less surgical abortions would be needed, saving the government money. Since mifepristone can be prescribed by family doctors and nurse practitioners, fewer women from rural and remote areas would need to make the long trek to urban centres to have surgical abortions. Once again, we're saving money, Mr. Speaker. With this in mind, will the minister commit to fully covering mifepristone?
Hear, hear.
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to correct part of the preamble to the member's opposite question. Mr. Speaker, I didn't say that we wouldn't cover it. Mr. Speaker, what I did say is we would review it. The medical students were here. They gave a very good presentation that I was glad to listen to. They asked for, and I promised them, a follow-up meeting with officials so they could do the same presentation for officials. And Mr. Speaker, I assured them, and I'll assure this House again today, that as we move through next budget cycle, it'll be reviewed and considered. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, the continued delay to fully cover mifepristone, despite all evidence suggesting it's a good idea, doesn't make any sense. If it's good for our finances and helps women in rural and remote communities, why does the minister keep delaying this process? When the Premier was running his leadership campaign, he told a pro-life political action group that when it came to issues of abortion, he'd defer to his caucus, a caucus that we know has many anti-choice members and cabinet ministers. We know it's not about money. Is it the anti-choice beliefs of the Sask Party caucus that are holding this government back from fully funding mifepristone for all Saskatchewan women?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, we know the NDP loves wedge politics, Mr. Speaker. I very clearly said we would review the matter. There's a number of things we need to consider. The cost, for example, Mr. Speaker, as the members opposite well know, they talk about low-income people not being able to afford it. Mr. Speaker, the most vulnerable are protected. There's plans in place for their pharmaceuticals to be paid for. There's also an emergency assistance plan, Mr. Speaker, for one-time use that somebody that finds themselves in a dire predicament can use it for pharmaceuticals, Mr. Speaker. But again, they go back to wedge politics, Mr. Speaker. You know, it wasn't long ago that the members opposite referred to themselves as a government awaiting. But Mr. Speaker, let's look at the record. When they were in government, Mr. Speaker, the difference between now and then, 900 more doctors, it wasn't the members opposite that did that, it was this government, Mr. Speaker. A new hospital in North Battleford, Mr. Speaker, it was this government that did it. Mr. Speaker, a soon-to-be-open children's hospital in Saskatoon, it was this government that's doing it. Mr. Speaker, a government awaiting? No.
Recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Education Minister did the right thing by walking back his decision to close Cornwall Alternative School. However, in his remarks about that decision, the Minister did nothing to calm fears that Cornwall will remain on the chopping block after this year, telling reporters that the decision to honour the agreement would, quote, buy us some time so we can move forward and go through a process to determine whether or not what's delivered at Cornwall, what's delivered at some of the alternative schools around the province, are actually doing what we expect them to do. It's hard not to interpret these words as a warning that funding could still be on the chopping block in next year's budget. To the Minister, what process will the Ministry follow in this promised review, and when will a decision be made about the future of Cornwall Alternative School for the 2020 school year and beyond?
I recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, last week I met with the teachers over at Cornwall Alternative School. Mr. Speaker, I met with their board last Thursday afternoon. Mr. Speaker, I plan on attending that school again on Thursday, Mr. Speaker, to meet with some students. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think it's fair to say that I'm not going to prejudge the budget that's going to be coming out, that we'll start to plan, Mr. Speaker, but I can tell you this. I was impressed with the work that they're doing over at Cornwall Alternative School, but I think it's fair to say as well, I think we need to look at what options are available to ensure that students that need special attention are getting special attention that they need. And what I said, Mr. Speaker, was I want to look at what the models are around the province, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that the programming that's made available to kids at Cornwall is the best possible programming that can be made available. I never made any comments about cutting funding next year, Mr. Speaker. This is a 3-year contract. The member asked me if I was going to ensure that we extended that contract for a further year. I said I would honor the terms of the contract, Mr. Speaker, and as we go forward, we'll have consideration and we'll have talk to the board, Mr. Speaker. We'll talk to the board chairs and the other school divisions, make sure that Cornwall is providing the services to the kids that they need.
Recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question was about the process that would be followed with regard to this review, and I'm not sure that the Minister has done anything to allay the fears that many still have. Teachers, staff and students are surely sleeping better this week, knowing that the doors of their school won't close this September, but the Minister's words give little comfort when it comes to September 2020 and beyond. The Minister has said that he was moved by the stories from students, teachers and board members into reversing his decision. He should be equally moved to committing that the funding will be continued past 2020. Why won't the Minister commit to ensuring that Cornwall Alternative School will continue to be funded into the future?
I recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, all the decisions that get made with respect to the budget of the Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Education, Mr. Speaker, will be considered in the normal course of our budget deliberations. What I can tell the member, Mr. Speaker, is that I was very impressed with the work that's being done over at Cornwall, Mr. Speaker. I'm impressed with the staff, Mr. Speaker. It's encouraged me to go back this week and visit with the students, Mr. Speaker, to make sure. And this process will continue, Mr. Speaker. I had a conversation with both board chairs, the Regina Public and Regina Catholic, last week to talk about this very issue, Mr. Speaker. But I'm not sure how anyone can take issue with the fact that we want to look to make sure that the programming that is being provided is the best possible options for these kids, Mr. Speaker. I can't confirm any stronger, Mr. Speaker, that I'm impressed with the work that's being done over there. It's good work, Mr. Speaker. The teachers are dedicated. The board is unbelievably dedicated, Mr. Speaker. I'm looking forward to having conversations with the students to see the successes, Mr. Speaker. But to suggest, Mr. Speaker, that we're just going to arbitrarily cut funding, Mr. Speaker, is not right, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to have conversations, continue to have this dialogue to make sure that we're providing the right services for kids in our school system.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills.
Item number 1, the Honourable Mr. Morgan.
I recognize the Minister of Justice. I recognize the Minister of Justice.
My apologies, Mr. Speaker. I've been truly chastised by my colleagues on the side of the House. And I've been told it's just starting. I move that Bill number 168, the Justices of the Peace Amendment Act 2019, a bilingual act, be now introduced and read a first time.
It's moved by the Minister that Bill number 168, is that correct? 168, be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Next sitting of the House, Mr.
Next sitting.
Can he read today?
Item number 2, the Honourable Mr. Cady.
I recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 169, the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency Act, be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 169 be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister.
Next sitting of the Assembly.
Next sitting. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 134, the Local Government Election Amendment Act 2018, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister.
I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill be now read the third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 134 and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may proceed to move third reading.
I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 134 be now read the third time, passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? It's a pleasure to Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee, Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 135, the Local Government Election Consequential Amendments Act 2018, a bilingual bill without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee in the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister.
I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill be now read the third time.
The Minister's requested leave to waive consideration in Committee in the Whole on Bill number 135 and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may move to proceed, the Minister may proceed to move third reading. I recognize the Minister.
I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
Been moved by the Minister that Bill number 135 be now read third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 138, the Miscellaneous Statutes, Government Relations Enforcement Measures Amendment Act 2018 without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered Committee of the Whole on bills? I recognize the Minister.
I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill be now read the third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration Committee of the Whole on Bill number 138 and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? Carried. The Minister may proceed to move third reading. Recognize the Minister.
I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 138 be now read third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Orders of the day.
Written questions. Question number 72 asked by Ms. Rancourt.
I recognize the Government Whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to table the answer to question number 72.
Tabled. Question 72.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 1, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 136, the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Act 2018. Ms. Sark.
I recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Pleasure to join debate again on Bill number 136, the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Act. We're ready to move this one to committee, Mr. Speaker, so that we can have that closer examination of the details of this legislation that the committee stage allows for. And as such, Mr. Speaker, I'd get ready to take my seat and invite my colleague, the Government House Leader, to do what he needs to do to advance this bill.
Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 136 be now read a second time. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? I recognize Government House Leader.
Designate that Bill 136, the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Act 2018, be committed to the Standing Committee on Economy.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on the Economy.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 2, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 139, the Foreign Worker Recruitment and Immigration Services Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Rancourt.
I recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, in a very similar theme to the last intervention, Bill number 139, the Foreign Worker Recruitment and Immigration Services Amendment Act 2018 is a debate that I've already participated in and look forward to the committee stage so that we might have a closer examination of the particulars of this piece of legislation. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd invite my colleague, the Government House Leader, to help advance this bill to the committee stage.
Question before the Assembly is motion by the Minister that Bill number 139 be now read a second time. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
This bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? I recognize Government House Leader.
I designate that Bill 139, the Foreign Worker Recruitment and Immigration Services Amendment Act 2018, be committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 4, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 157, the Education Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Moore.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon, Newt Chana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As my colleague before me from Regina, the riding of Regina Elphinstone Centre has indicated, I've already had the opportunity to raise concerns about this bill in adjourned debates, and so at this point, I don't believe there's any other commentary to be had, and we look forward to having a closer look in committee.
The question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 157 be now read a second time. It's at the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. To which committee shall this bill be committed? I recognize the Government House Leader.
I designate the Bill 157, the Education Amendment Act 2018, be committed to the Standing Committee on Human Services.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Human Services.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 3, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 158, the Youth Justice Administration Act 2018. Ms. Rancourt.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise this afternoon and enter in the debate around Bill number 158, the Youth Justice Administration Act. A lot of my colleagues have had the opportunity to speak to this bill already. I'm going to add a few more thoughts before I allow it to move on to committee. Essentially, this bill is codifying what is, from what I understand, a lot of policy and procedure that existed within the youth justice correctional system. It did give the opportunity to review quite a bit of the policy and procedure as it is, and I'll have a lot of questions for officials about that and the power that's being given in this bill. Mr. Speaker, Ad Committee in particular, some rules around seclusion, which is Part 5, and searches, which is Part 4, and ensuring that that number one, all of the procedures are being followed and complied with, and that they align with what we know to be proper process and appropriate process as it pertains to, as we know from what other jurisdictions have seen as well. I think I'm going to leave the rest of my comments for committee on this bill. Like I said, I will have many comments, but I think they're best left to committee. So at this point, I'm prepared to allow this bill to move on to its next stage.
Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 158 be now read a second time. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
I designate the Bill 158, the Youth Justice Administration Act 2018, be committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 7, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 165, the Workers' Compensation Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Witherspoon.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Hi, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise today and enter the debate. How's it going? Around Bill number 165, the Workers' Compensation Amendment Act. Sorry, my apologies, Mr. Speaker. I got a bit distracted from members on the other side. I know a lot of my colleagues have had the opportunity to already enter into this debate and add their thoughts, which are likely way more intelligent than mine, considering the way I opened this conversation on this bill, Mr. Speaker. But I will say that this bill does a few things. It amends some definitions and changes the composition of the board, which is I think will likely lead to some questions from the critic at committee with respect to how that is going to work and what sort of consultation has been done around that, Mr. Speaker. It's a very interesting piece of legislation, and I know I have other colleagues who are interested in entering the debate. So at this time, I am prepared to adjourn debate on Bill number 165.
The member has moved to adjourn debate on Bill 165. It's a pleasure to the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 5, Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 160, the Trespass to Property Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Chartier.
Recognize a member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour to rise this afternoon and enter in the debate around Bill number 160, the Trespass to Property Amendment Act. This is a very important piece of legislation that I know my colleagues have spent a lot of time already talking about and talking about the different concerns around this legislation. I know the member from Athabasca gave a very moving speech with respect to legislation that I encourage anyone who is about to watch or read my poor speech about this. I encourage them to read the member from Athabasca's speech about this, because it really outlines the concerns in a way that I'm not going to be capable of holding up to that standard, Mr. Speaker. There's a lot of concern around rural crime, Mr. Speaker, right now, and this piece of legislation is an outflow as a result of those concerns. The real challenge here is whether or not this legislation will actually successfully address those concerns, Mr. Speaker. We've heard a lot of concerns from hunters and recreational outdoors people, hunters, birders. I know one of the members, one of my colleagues have spoken about berry pickers, Mr. Speaker, and how what sort of effect this legislation is going to have on these sorts of recreational activities. Snowmobilers is another example that I know many in this province enjoy and love, Mr. Speaker, and whether or not the result of this legislation will actually be what members opposite are saying this legislation is intended to resolve. When we're when we're creating legislation, Mr. Speaker, it's important to ensure that the legislation that we are creating will actually solve the problem that we are saying that it's addressing, and isn't going to have unintended consequences that far exceed the success of what I suppose the government is trying to achieve here, Mr. Speaker. There is a lot, like I said, there is a lot of concern around real crime, and we see as a result of that this legislation. But what we haven't seen is a concerted effort by this government to create a crystal meth strategy or an opioid strategy, Mr. Speaker, in the province, which when you speak to those who work within RMs, Mr. Speaker, and those who work in policing as well, Mr. Speaker, they will say that some of the largest challenges right now and some of the results, the reason why we're seeing an increase in, or where we seem to be seeing, or people feel like they're experiencing an increase in property crime. A lot of this crime is related to addictions, Mr. Speaker. So again, we need to ensure that our actions in this chamber are going to create results that we are saying they will. And there is a lot of concern out there amongst stakeholders that the consequences of this bill will not actually achieve the results that the government is trying to achieve. I know others will want to enter into this debate, so at this point I'm prepared to adjourn debate on Bill number 160.
Members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 160. It's a pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 6. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 161, the Trespass to Property Consequential Amendments Act 2018. Ms. Chartier.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour to rise this afternoon and enter into debate around Bill number 161. I think I drew the short straw this afternoon, or I did something wrong to the Deputy Whip that caused me to be the sole speaker at the majority of the legislation this afternoon. But that's okay, because that allows me to control the clock. So maybe I'll talk for hours to punish the Deputy Whip, who has to stay here until I'm done, and the Government House Leader as well. I know I have 2 hours to speak to this legislation, so I might fulfill that, or maybe, you know, I will not do that. So this is companion legislation to the one I was just speaking to, Mr. Speaker, so I don't have any further comments to add other than the comments that I've already made around Bill 160. So at this point, I'm prepared to adjourn debate on Bill number 161.
Yeah.
Members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 161. Is it a pleasure of assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. Recognized Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the committees may do the good work this evening. I move this House to now adjourn.
It's been moved that the Assembly do now adjourn. It's a pleasure of assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. This Assembly stands adjourned until tomorrow at 10 a.m.